to Alice and Tim, who are going to do our first presentation. Before I go, sorry, I forgot to say, we'll have 2 minutes per paper, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. So let's go to the first introduction by Alice Sverdik and Tim Kelsall. Sorry,
Okay,
Tim.
Thank you. I will give just a very quick overview and then pass to Tim, since we're jointly giving a 2-minute presentation on behalf of several colleagues. In our paper, we were exploring COVID's evolving impacts and responses in the 3 cities of Mogadishu, Kampala, and Nairobi. We looked at an array of non-state actors, such as community health volunteers, youth, and women's organizations, who were key in assisting marginalized residents, but would often benefit from having additional government support and recognition during the pandemic. We also explored how private sector and civil society groups raised awareness about COVID using several creative initiatives that can be useful in complementing official risk communication strategies. We developed a typology of responses to COVID, ranging from top-down national task forces to increasingly bottom-up community solidarity networks. These activities focused on such issues as emergency relief, distribution, risk communication, service delivery, livelihoods, and data collection. We explored how many of these collaborations were typically emergency responses, as you would expect, but other interventions like enhancing health systems, countering police brutality, supporting multi-sectoral upgrading of informal settlements, and engaging more constructively with informality may offer new possibilities for more lasting and equitable change. I will stop there and pass over to Tim. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Alice. So in our paper, which was part of the same project, we looked at treatment, prevention, and mitigation of COVID-19 in Mogadishu, Kampala, and Nairobi. And we used political settlements analysis to help explain what we found. And what we did find was that Mogadishu had the lowest levels of treatment and the least ambitious attempts at mitigation. And we thought that that was probably not surprising, as it's a narrower and more dispersed political settlement than the other political settlements. And as such, we would expect elites to be less incentivized and less able to provide services. By contrast, Nairobi had the best treatment and the most ambitious mitigation. Again, that's not surprising because it has the broadest and most concentrated of the settlements, which would suggest that its elites are more incentivized and most able to provide services. Whereas with Kampala, that stood out, I think, for having the most stringent forms of prevention. And you could say that that's not really predicted by the type of political settlement. It's actually more about the role of the capital city in the settlement. Badru might have a bit of nuance to add here, but we would suggest that, Kampala is kind of a thorn in the side of the leadership in Uganda. It's a source of challenge to the leadership that needs to be contained. But then when we think about this role of the city in the settlement, it also sheds some light on Mogadishu's prevention efforts. For instance, what started as a quite stringent lockdown was relaxed as soon as there was a kind of political pushback. And we would argue that this is partly because the capital is really a sanctuary for the leadership, whose population it can't afford to antagonize too much. Whereas in Kenya, Nairobi is more of an electoral prize to be gained, and that perhaps stimulates a more balanced prevention with mitigation approach. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. So now I'm going to pass the word to Badru Bukenja from Makerere University, who would elaborate about the COVID-19 responses in Uganda. Thank you, Badru.
Hi, greetings from Kampala. Can you hear me?
We hear you perfect.
And thank you. So our study used the political settlement framework, not only to understand how politics influenced COVID-19 policy decisions, but also to explain the responses, why the responses had varied effects on the various population categories in Uganda. So the COVID-19 domain in Uganda consisted of several actors, including experts and non-experts, formal and informal, with varying degrees of influence, of course. The three most influential ones were the president, who was the chairman of the National Task Force on COVID-19, and who used his powers really to overshadow everybody else by taking charge of virtually all response activities, especially through the numerous COVID-19 directives that he issued. Closely associated to the president was the Scientific Advisory Committee, consisting of 17 experts co-opted to advise government on COVID-19. It was this Scientific Advisory Committee that played a leading role in the development of the different guidelines and the standard operating procedures, or SOPs, that the president relied on to guide the response in different sectors. Now, outside the formal response structure was the Joint Task Force, a paramilitary coordination mechanism which was set up to monitor and enforce public compliance to the measures issued by the president at the national and subnational levels. According to the study, the political settlement framework helped in analyzing or dissecting the social foundation of Uganda's political landscape. And through this, we find that blocs which were affiliated to the president tended to receive positive responses from the Scientific Advisory Committee. For example, in relation to reopening their activities. After the lockdown, Uganda had a phased approach to reopening, and in comparison, those linked to the opposition received unfavorable responses for reopening. Therefore, we can conclude that while the COVID-19 policy responses were dressed in the veil of science, in reality, these were carefully calibrated political tools. And as one observer of Uganda's politics accurately put it, the Ugandan general elections of 2021 represented a clear case in which COVID-19 restrictions were manipulated for political ends. I will also end it there for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Badru. That was great. Such a good synthesis. Now I'm going to pass the word to James Mensah from the University of Ghana Business School, who is going to continue with the theme of the political settlements analysis, but this time applied to informal markets. James, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to find out if I can share my screen. Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Yes, I want to find out if I can share my screen.
Yes, James, you can. Just go at the bottom. There's something that says share screen with an arrow. In my screen is green, so you can just click there.
Thank you.
We are seeing it.
I'm sure my screen can be seen now.
Yeah.
Yes, my study.
You only have 2 minutes.
Oh, my study is on institutional and governance of informal markets in Accra using a political settlement approach. Basically, most people in the global south make a living through informal market by selling, and previous studies have shown that markets are governed with institutional structures by local governments. However, recent studies have actually talked about the fact that there is some kind of antagonism between formal structures and informal structures that operates in the informal markets. And therefore, this study seeks to use a political settlement approach to examine how the intersection between law and structures. So I examined this through a collection of data from informal traders in the markets. And the finding shows that informal traders are often confused and they are often not sure of which of the structures to follow in the management of markets, because the city authorities have rules that works along the rules that the informal market also operates. And it appears that the informal rules in the market work better than the formal rules that are stated in the bylaws of local governments. In summary, this is what my work is about.
Thank you, James. Can you stop sharing the screen? Then I will pass the word to our last presentation now by Michael Roll, who is going to bring the discussion to the context of urban reform in Lagos. Michael, please.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. So my paper looks at urban reform in Lagos and at the lessons that we can learn from these experiences for urban political settlements analysis. My starting point is that Lagos for a long time has been presented as a rather successful case of urban reform in the past 2 decades by both development practitioners and academics. Lagos has grown its internal revenue by a lot. It has built urban infrastructure, has initiated huge land reclamation projects, initiated new urban waste management system and so on. So there have been lots of reforms. And while I agree that many of these reforms have been rather useful, they have not benefited and have instead often damaged the livelihoods of the majority of Lagosians, 60 to 70% of which are people who live in slums or informal settlements. So it is a somewhat successful kind of urban reform, but it is also very selective and exclusionary, driven largely by ideas of high modernist and neoliberal urbanism. In a second step, I performed an urban political settlements analysis of Lagos. And I did this because unlike most African cities, Lagos has a fairly high degree of autonomy in terms of both policies and finances. So it made sense to really focus on Lagos as a polity and perform this political settlements analysis. And I found that with a setting that can be described as narrow concentrated in political settlements terminology, the outcomes of these reforms are in line with what a political settlements analysis would actually predict. So in conclusion, I find that urban political settlements analysis is useful for the exceptional case of Lagos, at least. But I also suggest to look more at the role of multi-level governance systems, as Sam has already pointed out in the previous discussion, at the role of ideas about the types of urbanism that the elites are favoring, and to use the perspective of residents of slums or informal settlements that form the majority of residents in many cities in Africa as a useful analytical perspective. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for also keeping to time very briefly. And what we will do now is to have some discussion about any particular questions. And since I'm not seeing any hands, please do raise your hand if you want to speak or put your questions on the chat, and then I'll make sure that they are coming through. But since there are no questions yet, so I will start with some questions of my own. So my first question is going to be, maybe it's going to show that my knowledge of political settlements analysis is limited, but perhaps you can explain this to me a little bit. If political settlements analysis helps us to understand the configuration of power at a moment in time in the city, I would ask you, in what ways do the particular realities of the particular urban dynamics that you've encountered change the actual political settlements that existed, whether they are dynamic and they change in time? So for example, in the case of Alice and Tim, how did the pandemic change the existing political settlements in those cities that you looked at? In the case of Badru, how the pandemic has shifted the political settlement in Uganda. And in the other two cases, how urban reform and how informal markets do challenge political settlements and do change them through time. We can answer in order. So starting with Alice and Tim, and then.
Might defer to Tim on this one, since that was sort of the more explicit focus of his research, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. So I think I would say that the pandemic provided both a stimulus and an opportunity for these political settlements in all three countries to concentrate power, in the sense that it provided the kind of threat to elite survival which stimulated an increased degree of elite cohesion, which is a sort of a key ingredient of concentrated power. And at the same time, again, I think the threat led to a more kind of quiescent population. So it tamps down the disruptive potential of society. So again, this is something that aids power concentration. I think in Mogadishu, that was fairly temporary. It started to sort of fall apart quite quickly, and especially in the run-up to the election, that kind of elite cohesion disintegrated. I think it may have had more lasting effects in Kampala and Nairobi in terms of an increased militarization. I think we have to see what happens with the Nairobi Metropolitan Services, which I think was initiated just before the pandemic, but its kind of role was clearly augmented during the pandemic, and it provided the vehicle through which some big infrastructure projects were driven through which thousands of people in informal settlements were relocated. So yeah, I think, concentrated power brings with it certain advantages and disadvantages. It allows you to get things done, but not always in a kind of very equitable or consultative manner. So I think I'll let others have a go.
Okay, I can go next. Hopefully I can be heard. Sometimes you can speak and after a few minutes people can't hear you. Okay, so I agree with Tim that what the pandemic did was to increase the concentration of power. So in this way, the COVID-19 did not, at least for the case of Uganda, did not lead to changes in the political settlement, but rather in consolidation of already existing arrangements. And in my paper and in the video that I made, I give illustrations of how the different policy responses to COVID-19 actually allowed the leader or the ruling party to consolidate, its support in the two political blocks, one that where it has assured support, and the one which is contingently loyal to it, and then the same policies then were used to suppress the groups which are in the opposition bloc. I give several illustrations here. And at the end of it all, what we see is that, yeah, actually, COVID-19 helped, especially in terms of giving the ruling party additional resources to use in co-opting some members of the opposition, but also the restrictions were used to actually restrict opposition activities within Kampala, but also harass the populations that were residing within areas that are known to support the opposition. And as Tim has clearly indicated, it was also under the guise of COVID-19 restrictions that we see increased military presence on the streets of Kampala, which when time came for elections, many people have identified as responsible for the low turnout for voters in Kampala. So I will also end here and maybe give a chance to someone else to continue the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Badru. James, in your case, how do the dynamics of informal markets may challenge or not the political settlements in Accra?
Thank you so much. In the case of Ghana, power appears to be highly dispersed. In the case of the pandemic, we really saw that government used the opportunity to support the citizenry, especially the vulnerable people in society. And most market women receive a lot of support. So government used that as a way of consolidating its powers. And we saw the kind of support that was delivered to market women in terms of some financial support. And government used that as a way to consolidate the power that it has. Also, on the other hand, the government also needed the support of the market traders, especially their association leaders, in a way of helping them to spread the message about how to contain the COVID-19 pandemic. So whereas on one way, the government used that as an opportunity to consolidate its power, it also gave an opportunity to some vulnerable people in society, like informal traders, to be able to wield some power in a way to influence their members in order to ensure that the government was able to contain the pandemic.
Thank you. And Michael, in your case, do urban reforms also challenge the existing configurations of power in Lagos?
No, I wouldn't say that they challenged them, they rather consolidated them, primarily because the reforms were largely directed and driven by the respective Lagos state governors and small teams around them. And this was done pretty much in a top-down manner. And the actors that benefited from these reforms, either directly, economically, or that liked this modernist vision of Lagos, they supported this move. And therefore, the reforms really strengthened the existing political settlements. And the consolidated support, especially from both national, international business elites and high-class residents of Lagos. But it didn't do much to broaden the support.
Thank you for your answers, everyone. So now we have some questions from first Abdul Gafaru, please.
Okay, thanks very much. Can you please hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, you are loud and clear.
Thank you. So my question is to the COVID research team, and I just want to learn a little bit more in terms of how they possibly controlled for other potential explanations. I mean, so in team summary, he highlighted the variations of variations in the level of intervention across these countries, these cities that were studied. And I suspect some might claim that, well, such variations could probably have something to do with the size, with variations in the sizes of their economies, for example, levels of GDPs, or even the magnitude of the problem. If in city A, COVID cases appear much higher than in city B, one could argue that you would expect a much higher level of intervention in city A than in city B, but also even possibly the population distribution in these various cities. So just a little bit more in terms of how the project is actually taking into account some of these other potential alternative explanations.
Shall I answer that?
Please.
Yeah, thanks, Abdul Ghaffar. The short answer is that we didn't provide any very rigorous controls. I think that we have a plausible story about how political settlements have influenced policy responses in the cities concerned, but I think that we haven't been able to sort of demonstrate that this is a better explanation than other competing explanations. I think that, the research design simply didn't allow for that, unfortunately. But it's a very fair criticism. So.
Badru or Alice, you have any comments on?
I think that is, sorry, can I go first? Yeah, the team was, I was going to confess the same, that we did not actually think about, doing a rigorous analysis on ruling out other competing explanations. But I think going forward in terms of, because we are planning to publish the findings in, journal articles and all that, I think that is one of the things that we can, try to do through secondary sources and see if we can find other competing explanation and be able to rule them out. Yeah, so I think it is something for the future. Yeah.
Graeme, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks everyone. This is all very interesting. I suppose my question is primarily for Badru, but I think it perhaps has broader implications. So anyone can please sort of jump in. And it's sort of based on the fact that seeing everyone's sort of presentations, that what I'm really struck by is the sort of continuity here, and the fact that this was not a sort of critical juncture of structural and institutional change, but one in which sort of consolidation took place. And in a place like Kampala, I'm struck by the fact that there is a continuation of the sort of trends where technocratic language is in fact very thinly masking something that's about power and politics and shoring up the power of the ruling party and the president, and the importance of elections and how elections often involve selective enforcement of laws on different groups and sort of waves of repression that are directed towards electoral ends. So I suppose my question is, if we see this sort of shoring up of a sort of coalition of power, and if we see this greater centralization, do we also see from the people who are left out of these coalitions and of these benefits of this sort of selective policy enforcement, whether in design or implementation, do we see also a sort of showing up of the opposition sort of base of supports, particularly as people are negatively impacted by this rather selective and highly politicized exercise of power? So you went through these groups in your presentation of people who are within the sort of opposition group in a city like Kampala, which is itself a very, very significant opposition center in the country, like many African capital cities. And I wonder if this is something that perhaps has a flip side to it, that's not only greater sort of centralization of power, but also greater networking, greater sort of narratives around resistance to that power as well.
That is an interesting question. Thank you so much. Well, in the case of Kampala, it is, I mean, in the period just towards elections and soon after elections, that would have, been the case. You would see people trying to, the opposition trying to organize people to, to show them that, look, the government is marginalizing your areas, or the government is, painting the government as brutal through the numerous arrests and all that. But of recent, we have seen that actors within the opposition groups are tending to abandon the activism stance of politics, which used to show that clear distinction between, how the government is harassing them and then how it is benefiting, people who are affiliated to it. And we are now seeing a much more kind of sort of dialogue between the opposition and government, even at the moment where you would have expected, we have a serious economic crisis in Uganda, where, fuel prices are skyrocketing, prices for essential commodities are very high, and you would have expected the opposition to actually, be at the forefront, to mobilize masses, to go on the streets, to, to demand for changes in different policies, and so that their situation can improve. But the opposition figures seem to be in agreement with government that look, the problem is not internal to Uganda, but rather external, and maybe we would have taken the same approach solving it. So to put simply, that did not really materialize for the case of Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you, Badru, and thank you, Graham, for your question. I don't see a pressing question, so I'm just going to go ahead and ask another one of my own collection. And so, in fact, this one is as phrased. You see in our site, we have some comments about the session. So Sam has kindly articulated my questions in a broad way. So my question to all of you, all the presenters, is whether the political settlement analysis was really required to interpret your findings, and whether you could have perhaps have any other forms of explanation that could have been equally useful. And also related to that, one thing that I find really interesting, particularly when we see the organization of urban life and its relation to urban politics, is the role of intermediaries, a variety of actors that sometimes they don't have a clear role, and maybe they are hybrid, maybe they are a little bit part of the state, but not quite. And I wonder if your analysis of political settlements enables you to actually see the role of these intermediaries. So like Badru particularly is talk about a scientific advisory council, and James, there's something about the associations of traders and so on. I mean, that could be relevant there, or what role, for example, in the case of Michael, could play local associations or other forms of organization that may actually gain a lot of power at particular moments of time, and how that the political settlements analysis, I understand, enables to actually map those actors. So I wonder whether that was interesting. So we do it now the opposite way, starting with Michael, and then we go in the other direction.
Well, I can try, but I'm still in the process of thinking about the questions. Perhaps taking Sam's question first, was a political settlement analysis required for the analysis, or would I have come to the same results by just doing the regular political economy analysis? I think it was not really required, but it was useful because the political settlements analysis that I did sort of formalized the whole process a little bit more. And that forced me to look for data, to look for actual other studies or so, how big the support actually is, how concentrated the leadership is of the current governors. And that was quite useful to really check my own impressions that I had and check the impressions I got from the qualitative interviews. So I really liked that. And the fact that I came out with the same results just strengthened my conviction that this was quite useful. On the role of intermediaries, I'm not too sure how useful political settlements analysis is there. Yeah, not sure. I have to
but
think
maybe
about
you
it.
can explain a little bit about which intermediaries could have played a role in your case.
Yeah, I mean, if I think about the reform, most of the reforms were really economic private sector reforms. So there were a couple of associations, private sector associations, and even international private sector associations that worked together with the respective governors and their teams. And they were important. There are, of course, lots of other associations that focus more on slum residents, but they weren't successful at all. Under the first governors, they didn't even get to talk with them. Now, under the new governor, they're a little bit more open, but in terms of policy, it doesn't have any implications. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't change the general orientation. So, yeah, the reforms basically strengthened the associations that were in line with the reforms that they had planned, but they didn't do anything to strengthen the associations that were that focused on other topics like social support, education, health, and so on.
It's fascinating, the kind of big picture of the impossibility of challenging this particular political settlement. Yeah. James, what about in the informal markets in Accra?
Thank you so much. I think that political settlement could not be the only way to, or theory to use to examine informal markets in Accra. Previous studies have actually used theories such as institutional theory, but it appears like the emphasis has been on how the formal institutions worked. But in my study, I realized that there's a kind of power struggle, and to consolidate, for politicians to consolidate their power, they also need to know how to operate and play around these powers. Because, for instance, the mayor of Accra officially is supposed to be selected by the president of the republic, and then maybe confirmed by 2/3 of assembly members, that is the local councillors. However, chiefs has a role to play in this selection. If you look at market women, that's the informal market traders, they have a say, because the queen mother of the Market Women Association is so powerful to the extent that they could also influence the decision of who becomes the mayor of Accra. So all this power play means that you need to know how to navigate around this to be able to manage such a city. So there are formal rules called the bylaws of the city. It talks about how a market must operate, who gives land to who gives store to who, what are the rules. However, these are difficult to enforce because there are also other powerful actors where you need them to legitimize your power. You need them to be able to successfully manage the city. So I realized that this issue of formal structures, informal structures, power struggle, you need to use a political settlement approach to be able to examine this and explain the findings of your study. So, and this draws into the issue of intermediaries, where the chiefs and then the queen mothers or the market leaders, the associations are also important in this dynamics. Thank you.
Yeah, that was so interesting, James, and also aligned with a lot of debates about how we treat the formal and the informal and whether that dichotomy is always useful. So Badru, what about you? You have any comments?
No, well, I agree with the informal, sorry, I agree with the former presenter about his point about the political settlements analysis being in position to highlight the informal aspect of power. So whereas alternative explanations, for example, around urban governance and all that would put a lot of emphasis on formal structures, the political settlement analysis helps us to recognize that sometimes informal structures are more powerful and also at times more powerful than even the formal ones. But also it helps us to direct us at the different actors that we need to pay attention to at different levels, at national level and the city level, and it can even take us to much more lower levels of analysis. So in that way, I feel that the political settlement framework is much more superior than other competing explanations. Now, about the intermediaries and the coalitions, I think in our paper we do try to explain how the different groups, different interest groups were approaching the scientific advisory committee in terms of persuading it that their sector needed reopening. And so you would see that the different groups were, kind of, they were not formally organized, but during that time they came together and they would, have some semblance of leadership. They would come up with position papers showing, how their sectors or subsectors are quite influential in terms of the overall national economy, but also to illustrate to the scientific advisory committee that, look, we have what it takes to ensure that when you reopen us, we can put in place measures to contain the pandemic. And so we try to illustrate how those behind the curtain negotiations took place. And I think that is, one of the best ways to illustrate how intermediaries and the ad hoc coalitions were at play for the case of Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you, Badru. And just like one quick last word from Alice before we break.
Yes, sorry. I do think that our paper did try to engage with these whole constellations of non-state actors, including intermediaries such as religious leaders or youth groups. And so I think in many ways, some of what we were doing was complementary to the political settlements analysis, but we didn't quite have a term for what we were doing. So we came up with kind of different typologies of relationships, such as cooperation, collaboration, sort of more horizontal relations of power, but also discussed issues such as challenges and precedent setting by grassroots groups that I think may help to answer some of what Graham was saying, but I don't want to shoehorn this in right before we need to close. But we did try to recognize its sort of different scales of analysis and different constellations of actors that may not be as readily captured in a political settlements framework that obviously are still an important part of this response to COVID. So.
Yeah, thank you, Alice. I did find that an analysis of horizontal relations quite fascinating. Thank you, everyone. Badru, James, Michael, Tim, Alice, please join us for the third session to finalize this whole round, in which we will be discussing a little bit more on the same topic in just 10 minutes. So I look forward to see you all there, and thank you very much. Thank you for all the fantastic questions and comments. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.